We are heading to week 11 in fantasy football, which means it's officially crunch time if you're trying to make the fantasy playoffs, avoid your league punishment, or get a first round bye. In this video, we are talking about the players that are currently available on the waiver wire that you need to add to your team if you want to improve your chances of winning not just this week, but in coming weeks as well. And I want to talk about a situation that we've been calling out on this channel now for 2 or 3 weeks, yet the player involved is still available in over 50% of leagues. It has to do with Jacksonville because Brian Thomas was ruled out with an ankle injury this past week against the Texans, and odds are it's a high ankle sprain. They might want to say that it's a not severe high ankle sprain, but this is usually a multi-week injury for wide receivers. And in his replace, we ended up seeing Jakobi Meyers make his debut after getting traded from the Raiders before the trade deadline. He played. We saw Parker Washington also play, and some other wide receivers were involved, but the big story here is Parker Washington. Although Jakobi Meyers on somewhat limited snaps in his debut led the team with 41 receiving yards, Parker Washington had 33 receiving yards. He had a touchdown early in that game in a red zone, a 7-yard touchdown, and he led the team once again for the 3rd straight game in targets. He had 7 targets. He also returned a punt for a touchdown. Parker Washington very quietly lately has been great in terms of fantasy, a very viable flex option, 17 more points this past week, and he's been awesome for the Jaguars who are dealing with wide receiver injuries. Now this past week you see a 21% target share. That's not all that exciting. The targets were mostly spread out in this game, but still he was the only player on the team across all positions to clear a 20% target share. He led the team easily, running 94% of the routes. Nobody else topped 70% of the routes. And now if you look at this over the last 2 games, right? The past 2 games since Travis Hunter has gone down with injury and Brian Thomas left last game early, Parker Washington leads the team with a 25% target share, running almost every single route, 92% of the routes. He's now been a full-time player on offense for about 3 games now. 3 total games since Travis Hunter went down with injury. And during that time, he's averaging 8.7 targets and 12 fantasy points per game, which is very legitimate flex starter production for you in your lineups. And you can see, according to Ryan Heath on Twitter, Parker Washington, if we pull it up here, he's now had at least 20% target share in 4 of his last 5 games when he's ran at least 50% of the routes. Thanks to a punt return touchdown today, he exceeded 17 fantasy points now in back-to-back games. This is a player who's coming off of an 8-catch, 90-yard game, a player who's involved in many ways. This past week, he also had an end around in the red zone. They're trying to get the ball in his hands, and that should probably continue for at least another week or 2 until these other wide receivers potentially come back from injury. To try and add Parker Washington, he is a priority, and so is the tight end Cade Otton. This is a guy who we've been talking about, Cade Otton. He was deemed a must-start tight end by us in previous weeks because whenever Chris Godwin and Mike Evans the last 2 years, last year and so far this year, have missed time, Cade Otton has stepped up in a major way, and that continued this past week. Because Cade Otton went out there, and although Ibuka was leading the team 115 yards, he seems healthy off his hamstring injury. Cade Otton led the team actually in receptions, 9 catches, 82 yards, had 12 targets in this game. He looked awesome out there. At the tight end position, he almost had a 30% target share. He ended the day with a 28% target share, was the number 1 target in this game ahead of Ibuka for Baker Mayfield. Now, the downsides for Cade Otton that people will call out, and rightfully so, is that he doesn't get a lot of downfield targets. He hasn't gotten a lot of red zone targets so far. I will say so far, that could obviously change. He's mostly getting targets in the middle of the field, and in this game, the Bucs trail, which might not happen often. Now, all those things are true, but we have a pretty large sample now. So far, 3 games this season with both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin out, you're getting a 26% target share for Cade Otton, number 2 amongst tight ends, nearly 60 receiving yards per game is top 10, and about 12 fantasy points per game despite not scoring a touchdown is top 12 amongst tight ends. This past week, he set season highs, and when you even take it back to last season, you don't just look at this season, you take it back to last season when Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were dealing with injuries. Across those 7 games, Cade Otton is now averaging 9 targets, 7 receptions, and 60 receiving yards per game. That basically makes him a top 5 tight end when these 2 guys have been out the past 2 years. And the reason why that's at least worth calling out is because last year, although there was a different offensive coordinator with Liam Cohen there, who's now gone and he left to go to Jacksonville, it's still the same quarterback and for the most part, same personnel pieces around him. Here's what this looks like right now. Cade Otton to start the season basically was not involved. Like, he was a waiver wire tight end. You didn't want to add a guy getting 5 points, 3 points. But since these guys have gone down, Mike Evans and also Chris Godwin, you're getting double-digit fantasy points now in 4 out of his last 5 games. Currently, the most recent week, this past week, is not currently updated. Cade Otton, when you look at his target competition, like, I'm pretty sure Chris Godwin, who did not practice at all this past week, was ruled out pretty quickly. He's probably not playing football for a while. We got a report that's probably said at least another month. Mike Evans, they're saying, I mean, he's on IR. They're not saying he's technically done for the year. Maybe he comes back for the real-life playoffs. But if we're talking about about the target competition, Tej Johnson has indeed been nice. Maybe we'll talk about him later in this video. Sterling Shepard's getting phased out in the middle of the field, and Emeka Egbuka is dominating on the outside right now. It's pretty much middle of the field targets right now. K-Dot. If Baker Mayfield drop backs, he doesn't see his guy open on a first or second progression, he's going to K-Dot and as his like security blanket check down. It is somebody that I'm very interested in acquiring right now off the waiver wire, because look at some of these matchups coming up. Matchups against the Bills and the Rams the next 2 weeks. These are games where the Bucs might have to throw 40 plus times yet again to stay in it. That's where Otton can get a lot of targets. Then you get to the fantasy postseason matchups against a Falcons team, a defense that has been hit or miss, a Panthers defense that has been hit or miss, definitely. So these are spots where definitely these next few weeks, if you need somebody to get by at the tight end position, and maybe even after that, K-Dot is somebody that I'm looking at. I'm also looking at Alec Pierce, who continues to be available in nearly 60% of fantasy leagues, believe it or not, right now. And maybe he's already picked up in your league, which if that's the case, we're going to get later on in this video to some deeper targets, deeper league options for you. But right now, Alec Pierce is very appealing. Quietly, and it might not seem like that since he's had a good year so far. This past week, 4 catches, 84 yards, had a deep touchdown over the top in double coverage. He ended up coming down with it. That was his first touchdown reception, I believe, of the season. So that was kind of interesting. But this guy, he's coming off of a 100-yard game 2 weeks ago. He was dealing with concussions and injuries right before that. But when he's been active this year, he's been, especially the past month, like the Colts' best receiver ahead of Michael Pittman, who this past week only had 2 targets. If we look at the stats from this past week, running 92% of the routes, led the team. He's their primary downfield outside receiver and a 28% target share. Look at this. It was all the Alec Pierce show. Now, if we're being real here, the overseas game in Berlin was all the Jonathan Taylor show, but at least from a pass catcher standpoint amongst the wide receivers, because Tyler Warren also got activated a lot in this game, no other wide receiver saw above an 8% target share in this game. It was all Alec Pierce. He was seeing downfield usage. He was seeing the wide receiver targets. And now, if we look at Ryan Heath on Twitter, over the last 4 games, Alec Pierce has seen a target share of 29%, 16, 24, and 27%. Over this span, he leads the Colts in targets with 34 and receiving yards per game with 92. That would rank 4th amongst all wide receivers in the NFL. The past month of the season, Alec Pierce has quietly been the Colts' best receiver, averaging nearly 100 yards per game, and he's been a top 12 fantasy receiver during that time. Yeah, he's been pretty good. He also now, for the second straight the season, is leading the NFL in yards per catch, despite having a different quarterback behind center. He ranks, if we just were to like scroll through some of his stats right here as well, he's like top 5 in pretty much everything. Deep targets, he's 6th with 14, averaging 2 per game. He's top 5 in air yard share. He's number 2 in average target distance in terms of where his depth of target is this year. He has a very valuable role in this offense, and he's going to be on his bye this week. But when he comes out of the bye week, tougher matchups, right? You're going to talk about the Chiefs, but then and the Texans. You start to look at it though. After that, once you get to the fantasy postseason, you're going to get 2 matchups against the Jaguars. We just saw what Davis Mills had the best quarterback week of the season, or the week last year, against this Jaguars secondary, and then a 49ers defense that is not the same 49ers defense that you're used to. The fantasy postseason schedule for the wide receivers of the Colts, especially Alec Pierce, is very good. It makes him a flex worthy for sure, maybe wide receiver 2 or 3 in your lineup. Even though he's going on his bye, he's worth a stash. Now, before we get into the next player in this video, I've got something great to share with you. I've teamed up with DraftKings Pick 6, the official daily fantasy sports partner of the NFL, where you can turn your game day reads into real payouts fast. All right, now here's how it works. All you do is pick more or less on 2 or more player stats, from breakout rookies to elite quarterbacks, and watch every snap get way more interesting. The better your calls, the better your payouts. It's basically that simple. There's no convoluted rules. Just pick 2 or more player stats, the more or less on them, and watch your players perform. And now here's the best part for you. Right now, new DraftKings customers that play $5 or more get $50 in Pick 6 credits. So trust your instincts and download the DraftKings Pick 6 app now using code SAL to get in on the action. In partnership with DraftKings Pick 6, the crown is yours. All right, let's go back to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because I kind of mentioned pretty quickly Tej Johnson, because he continues to carve out a role, especially when it comes to scoring touchdowns for this Tampa Bay Bucs offense. They came out of their bye week. Tej Johnson, 4 catches, 42 yards, multiple touchdowns in this game, had yet another good game, 20 plus fantasy points. He's now scored touchdowns, I believe, in 3 straight games. A couple of deep touchdowns. Should have had another touchdown as well a couple of weeks ago before the bye, but Baker just missed him on that one. Tej Johnson has been a playmaker. Emeka Egbuka is there. K-Dot is emerging on the underneath. But Tej Johnson, I mean, this Bucs wide receiver room is going pretty deep this year. In this game, Tej Johnson ran 87% of the routes. He was a clear and obvious outside receiver for most of this game, right next to Emeka Egbuka. And when you break it down, this has been a quality wide receiver, and he's finally finally, if we look at it over his last 4 games, since basically becoming a starter in this offense, he's starting to break out and produce, which is not something a lot of people, including myself, thought this smaller wide receiver out of college was going to be able to do in the pros. In 4 games as a starter this year, Tez is averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game, and he's currently getting about 5 or 6 targets per game, a very quality flex option at worst for you, especially with players like next week Chris Olave and the Colts wide receivers going on by. If you're not familiar, Tez Johnson was somebody in college these last couple of years, especially a couple of years back. He spent time with Bo Nix there. I believe he's like technically like the adopted brother or something of Bo Nix, something along those lines. 1,200 yards a couple of years ago. Last year, 900 yards, so he kind of dropped a little bit because of that, and the fact that a lot of people were like, I think this wide receiver is like 145 pounds. He fell in the NFL draft, fell to a good offense in the Bucs. A couple of injuries happened to veteran wide receivers. It's giving him an opportunity, and he's starting to shine. This is not somebody you want to spend all your fab budget on, but I don't know. I have it in the waiver wire tiers over in the Fantasy Blueprint. You can check it out. Link down below at jointheblueprint.com, but this is somebody that you could probably put 10, 15, if you're in a competitive league, 20 to 30% of your budget on, because we're late in the season. If it was week 1, I wouldn't put that much, but we're late in the season. You can't take that fab with you into next year. Now let's talk about a running back here in Tyler Allgeier coming off his best performance of the season because he found the end zone multiple times. He had 11 carries in this game, 57 yards, so he was still efficient, 5.2 yards per carry, multiple touchdowns in this game. Actually, specifically in this game, according to Ryan Heath over on Twitter, Tyler Allgeier received all 3 carries inside the 10-yard line compared to Bijan Robinson's 0. He's now had 5 to Robinson's 1 inside the 10-yard line the past 4 games, and Bijan Robinson hasn't scored a rushing touchdown during this span. So very quietly, he's kind of becoming like the goal line back for this team. It makes sense. He's a really big body back. He's a trusted player dating back to his time at BYU. He was the player who can kind of do everything, run between the tackles, protect the ball, kind of like how Ray Davis was coming out of college as well for the Buffalo Bills. This is a quality running back. We saw what he did as a rookie. He put up over 1,000 yards. He averaged nearly 5 yards per touch. Over his final like 5 or 6 games out of the bye week as a rookie in 2022, he was a top 10 fantasy player, averaging over 100 rushing yards per game for the Falcons. Obviously, that was 3 or 4 years ago, many coaches ago at this point. No Bijan Robinson during that time, but the whole point that I bring that up is right now he's producing. He literally just had a 20 fantasy point week, was a top 10 running back last week because they trust him in the red zone. And Tyler Allgeier has had multiple other weeks where he's been fantasy relevant. In week 2, he had a top 20 finish with 15 fantasy points. He's had multiple 10 and 11 point games as well. And this past week, he just had 20 points. He has double-digit fantasy points right now this season in 4 to 5 games, depending on your league's scoring format, which means he's a flex option, especially during the bye weeks. And more importantly, if Bijan Robinson was to ever miss time, that's when Tyler Allgeier quickly becomes now like a week in and week out top 12, at worst top 15 fantasy running back. If we look at the upcoming schedules, like it's going to be pretty good. You're going to get matchups against the Saints, against the Panthers, where these game scripts will be neutral, or the Falcons will be leading to lean on maybe Tyler Allgeier a little bit more in the second half. So I'm interested right now in Tyler Allgeier as a clear and obvious waiver wire priority. He's still available in nearly 60% of leagues. And Troy Franklin is still available in over 50% of leagues. That's the threshold for this video unless I say otherwise. Over 50% of leagues right now, all these players are available in. Troy Franklin barely available. He's available in about 51 to 52% of leagues. On some formats, he's available in 55%, but he's just been the clear-cut most trusted wide receiver right now this past month of the season for Bo Nix. You look at this past week on a Thursday night game against the Raiders, that was disgusting to watch. I went to a bar specifically to watch that with my brother. In the first half, we watched it at a bar. It was literally the most disgusting game I think I've watched all season long. So that was pretty gross, but the only thing that really stood out for the offense, I would say, of the Denver Broncos was Troy Franklin. 5 catches, 40 yards, and a touchdown. Now that's nothing special. Sure, it's a nice fantasy day of 16 fantasy points. More importantly, though, 9 more targets in this game, almost double the amount of targets as anybody else in this game. Bo Nix has been struggling immensely. Like over the past month of the season, maybe he's had like 2 to 3 good quarters of football. He's been struggling, but the one consistent piece week in and week out has been Troy Franklin. Specifically over the last month of the season, Troy Franklin, who's doing it a lot because of touchdowns, but he's averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game on 9.3 targets per game, as you can see right here according to RotoViz's game split tool. Before that, the first 6 games of the year, Troy Franklin not even 10 fantasy points per game, had about 50% less targets per game, but 6 targets per game. So far this year, he's looked really good. We're finally starting to see that chemistry that the two of them had together during their time in college at Oregon, where you saw the best season from Troy Franklin, starting to see that this year in the pros. That season specifically, Franklin had 115 targets from Bo Nix, nearly 1,400 receiving yards, 17 yards per catch was was a downfield weapon. We're seeing that's really come together this year, 14 touchdowns that season as well. So the connection is now translating to the NFL. And more importantly, I do think Courtland Sutton is still a buy low if we really have the sample of the past, I don't know, 16 to 20 games with Bo Nix. Troy Franklin or Courtland Sutton has clearly been an alpha for this team. The past month has been pretty bad though. Franklin has been more valuable in fantasy over the past month, whether it's come to just touchdowns, fantasy points per game. He's been more of the wide receiver one in this offense compared to Sutton. I don't know if that continues all throughout the fantasy postseason, these next 6 to 7 weeks of the year, but right now it's a real thing and it's sustaining for the past 4 or 5 weeks. If we look at the upcoming schedule, there's going to be some competitive games here. They're at home against the Chiefs in a really big game because despite the Broncos offense looking terrible, they're still an 8-2 team this year, partially because of some bad offenses and bad teams they face, partially because of their good defense, a great defense I will add to that. Then you're going to get matchups that start to get a little bit nicer for them. Matchups against the Commanders, the Raiders, the Jaguars heading into the fantasy postseason. So it's a little bit of a hot or cold in terms of like the matchups, but at this point, this guy's on the waiver wire. He's putting up over 16 points per game the last month of the season. He needs to be on all rosters, not just like 45% of rosters. Now I want to talk about the Patriots wide receiver room. We talked about this in our Monday video a little bit because Kayshon Boutte was out and how that was going to affect the wide receiver room, who would see some more usage. Well, we got our answer. Mack Hollins, 6 catches, 106 yards, 10 targets in this game, led the wide receiver room. The rookie Kyle Williams, the 3rd round pick out of Washington State, they said Kyle Williams would get more involved in the offense, or at least they wanted to see that with no Kayshon Boutte. He got a touchdown catch for 72 yards in this game. Wasn't anything crazy in terms of his target share, but Kyle Williams, we did get to see him kind of show off his athleticism at the NFL Combine, ran his 4.4 time. And look, this was like his first look at extended run in this offense. If you look at it here, he ended up running 58% of the routes. That was a season high for Kyle Williams. Now, it only led to 7% of the targets, as you can see right here, but you have to take this in stride, right? This was a rookie who wasn't playing all that much on offense, doesn't have that much chemistry with Drake May compared to veteran wide receivers like Mack Hollins, who have been involved with the first team offense, and obviously Stephon Diggs. So this week, it could just be that, yeah, he had a great explosive play of 72 yards, and that's what he kind of brings to you as a young, explosive, fast player, but he had 58% of the snaps. Let's say Kayshon Boutte, who is dealing with a hamstring injury, usually takes a couple weeks to come back from if it is indeed a strain, which it seems like since he missed a week. What if this goes from 58% to 70%? And now he's going from seeing only 1 or 2 targets to seeing 3 to 5 targets. In your deeper leagues, when Drake May has been so good this year, an MVP candidate, that is at least worth rostering. Now, in your 12-team, 10-team leagues, right, for the most part, unless you're in a bad bye week situation, you're probably not starting Kyle Williams this upcoming week. I'd be more likely to start Mack Hollins, who this past week I just showed you he had 6 catches for 106 yards, and 2 out of the last 3 weeks, 3 weeks ago, 7 catches, 89 yards. So he's actually been a focal point of the offense from a passing attack, leading the team in targets, receptions, receiving yards in 2 out of his last 3 games. Now, again, it's a small sample. It's Mack Hollins for the most part, hasn't been a consistent wide receiver from a production standpoint in the NFL all that much, being fantasy relevant wise. But if you're in a bye week situation, I would prefer Mack Hollins over Kyle Williams, and it's probably going to be short lived. Kayshon Boutte should be back in maybe 1 to 2 at most 3 weeks, and then it's just going to be gross again for this wide receiver room. Now, before we get into this next running back that I would consider a priority add in all fantasy leagues, and he's currently available, I think, in like over 80%, nearly 90% of leagues right now. If you want to get my #1 waiver wire ad at every single position completely free this week, there's a link in the description below, or you can type into your device just waiverwins.com. That takes you to this page. You just enter your email right here, and then just be on the lookout. After a couple of minutes, it should be in your inbox. If you don't see it after like maybe 3 to 5 minutes, check your spam or promotional folders. That's how you get my #1 waiver wire ad at every position, not just for this week, but the rest of the season as well, so you know exactly who you should be targeting on the waivers, the top ad options heading into your fantasy postseason and ultimately your championship week. All right, now that running back that's available in some leagues, 90% of leagues right now, is going to be Blake Corum. Now, if you look at the game logs, nothing's going to jump off the box score. It's not going to be rushing to add him for most of your friends. 13 carries, 56 yards, just 4.3 yards per carry, doesn't get involved as a pass catcher. So you might be saying like, well, why do I want to stash this guy? Well, the reason why you want to stash him is this past week, for the first time all year, this was a split backfield. 14 carries went to Kyren Williams, 13 went to Blake Corum. Blake Corum played a season high 37% of the snaps, which is nothing crazy, but 48% of the rush attempts. This game started off with Kyren Williams getting the first drive, then the second drive went to Blake Corum, third drive Kyren Williams, fourth Blake Corum, and so on and so forth. That was the first time all year we saw that type of usage, like them just splitting a drive each, and both guys played well, so I think it can only continue. And the reason why this matters is now it's making Blake Corum, who has 13 carries in back-to-back games, and arguably the best team in the NFL and one of the best offenses in the NFL, the Rams right now. Like, if you're going to see a baker's dozen in carries every week, you shouldn't be available in over 90% of leagues because you're already a flex option if you're going to get 12 to 15 touches per week in a really good offense with red zone usage. But if something was to happen to Kyren Williams, who in his career has dealt with plenty of foot and ankle problems. Well, that's where Blake Corum immediately becomes a week in and week out, probably top 10 running back in most options, where with this Rams offense, he'll be a favorite. He'll be in the red zone a lot. And this is a really big switch up. Like Kyren Williams playing 60% of the snaps last week is still a very commanding role in an offense, but compared to last year when Kyren Williams was playing 88% on average of the Rams snaps, number 1 in the NFL, seeing 83% of the opportunities, number 2 in the NFL, like that's completely switched these last 2 weeks with Blake Corum averaging 13 carries per game. Again, I mentioned this on the Monday video when we talked about this backfield a little bit. Blake Corum is not the RB1 here. He's not stealing the job from Kyren Williams. He's just forcing more of a split, which is important because if something happens to Kyren, it's going to be Blake Corum's backfield. And at worst, he's going to be one of these supercharged, like Tyler Algier type backs who are going to see 10 to 12 carries with red zone upside and a good offense. And just sort of a closing note on what we're talking about here. This is from JJ Zacharyson on Twitter, the late round quarterback. He says that Kyren Williams running back rush shares over the last 3 weeks have gone from 50 to 66% to 52%. In 2024, Kyren Williams' lowest single game running back rush share was 60%. So already 2 out of the last 3 weeks, he set new career lows, or at least 2-year lows in rushing share. That's because of Blake Corum. He's been really good, and Sean McVay is building trust for Blake Corum, and when Sean McVay trusts your running back, you play a lot, and you play a lot more. Next situation I want to quickly touch on is a tight end in case you need tight end help and Cade Otton is already rostered. We could talk about Theo Johnson here because he's quickly becoming one of the more consistent tight ends in fantasy. I mean, this past week, 7 catches, 77 yards attached to Jackson Dart, who did leave this past week's game with a concussion, so we do have to monitor that if he'll play next week against the Packers. But since week 4, since Jackson Dart has taken over in this offense, Theo Johnson, the first 3 games of the season with Russell Wilson, just 3 fantasy points per game. Since then, 11.5 fantasy points per game on 5.5 targets per game. Theo Johnson has been comfortably, since week 4, a top 12 fantasy tight end week in and week out. If you're in a multi-flex league during the bye weeks, you might have had to stash him in there. Odds are you got you a touchdown or a decent amount of receptions. This is a big and physical 6'6", 259 pound tight end. And if you remember him coming out of Penn State, I mean, one of the most athletic tight ends you'll see. 4.57 40 time. There we go. For this big of a tight end is 98th percentile speed score, top 2% to ever attend the combine amongst tight ends that are his size. He has a great combination of being able to catch the ball, run after the catch, size, speed, all that's pairing really well with Jackson Dart, who can extend plays and really just keep the offense on the field. Now we'll see heading into week 11 if Jackson Dart can play against the Packers. He was ruled out. It's sort of a 50-50 thing when it comes to concussions, but moving forward, matchups against the Lions, the Patriots, even the Vikings, like they're probably going to be trailing in these games, having to throw 30 to 40 times compared to some of the other lower volume games that Jackson Dart has had this year. You're probably going to get more pass attempts. And as of right now, due to all the injuries on this team, Darius Slayton hurt his hamstring again this past week. Theo Johnson should remain a priority target for whoever the quarterback is. Now I want to go to the Green Bay wide receiver room for a couple of reasons here. I want to talk about both Christian Watson, who's available in over 70% of leagues, and I want to talk about Jayden Reed, who's available in over 80% of leagues. He has still not returned from his injury, his shoulder injury, but he could be returning any week now. The reason why that's important is, well, first off, these are 2 talented players in a good offense, but Tucker Kraft is now done for the season with a torn ACL. The wide receiver room in general for the Packers has been highly inconsistent this year outside of Romeo Doubs, who's really come on the last month of the season. I mean, it's basically just been injuries to Dontavian Wicks. It's been injuries to Jayden Reed himself. Matthew Golden's now banged up. He's been inconsistent even when he's been out there as well as a rookie, as you would probably expect. So these 2 wide receivers in Christian Watson and Jayden Reed, I mean, they're going to be big focal points, arguably the top 2 wide receivers from a playmaking standpoint on this team once they're back and healthy. Now, obviously, Christian Watson's already been back and healthy. These last 2 weeks, he's put up 12.5 and 7.8 fantasy points on 85 and 58 receiving yards. Against the Panthers last week, had just 2 catches for 58 yards. But more importantly, he ended up playing a lot more. He had a tough matchup as well in that game against J.C. Horn, the Panthers standout cornerback, but we saw more usage. In week 1, coming back from this knee injury, Christian Watson ran 54% of the routes. Last week, he got up to 71% of the routes run, 66% of the snaps. He's becoming an every down player. He has a little bit of extra time this week now that they play on Monday night against the Eagles. I'm recording this before that game goes off. So assuming Christian Watson doesn't get hurt in this game, he's going to continue to be a waiver add, assuming he doesn't get hurt, or like even if he puts a 0 up, but he gets a lot of routes run, he's still going to have to be somebody that you look at in a good offense who's actually out there playing. And then there's Jayden Reed, who you have to look at because, I mean, this guy has been really good with Jordan Love the last couple of years. As a rookie, he averaged 13.6 points per game. Last year, battling injuries, he averaged 12 fantasy points per game. game. He only played in 1.25 games this year, but in week 1, he scored a touchdown. He had double-digit fantasy points. And week 2, early on in that game on Thursday night against the Commanders, he makes a diving, what looks like 40-yard touchdown catch at the right pylon, ends up being just out of bounds, or an incomplete pass, ends up injuring his shoulder, and now he's been gone since then. This is still a talented wide receiver who, if he's able, let's just say, to return in week 11, which probably seems unlikely at this point, but he would have a good matchup against the Giants. But either way, heading into the fantasy postseason, you're going to get a matchup against the Bears, a matchup against the Ravens, and right before the postseason starts, another matchup against the Bears. Like, these are amazing matchups for Jayden Reed, who arguably, now with Tucker Kraft out, arguably is like the #1 playmaker on this team, since Josh Jacobs continues to deal with his own calf injury as well. So the Packers wide receivers are worth adding as well. Now, these are the guys you should add this week before your friends do. If you want to see the biggest takeaways from week 10, outside of what we just talked about, some other key things that you have to keep in mind heading into week 11, you can check out this video. It dropped on Monday right here. I think it's going to help you a ton as you prepare for week 11.